So, a couple of course things before we get going. I just heard from the TA like an hour ago, the second TA, that he's finished marking your argument analyses, so they should be posted shortly. And I believe the tests have been marked as well. I don't have them to give back to you today. So we should be getting marks back to you this week for certain. The second argument analysis has been posted. The second arguments for analysis have been posted. So take a look at those. And the procedure for those is exactly the same as on the first argument analysis. There's no change to the format or what you need to do. Just do the same thing, but slightly better, hopefully. I'm way behind on posting the third quiz. I'm sorry about that. I just haven't written it yet. So I'll post that as soon as possible, send out a message when I do, and it'll be due 1 week after I post it. So it's not that it's going to be suddenly due on you. OK? A couple of other things. There was a request for somebody to be a note taker for this class. So if you have notes from this class and you want to help one of your fellow classmates out, it would be really appreciated. Get in contact with me, and I'll put you in touch with the note taker people, if you wouldn't mind. And course evaluations are open, I believe. So that's my main way of getting feedback about how this course went and how the university gets feedback about how I did in this course. So please fill out those course evaluations and say great things about me. That would be awesome. Thank you. Actually, tell me the truth. It would be more helpful to tell me the truth. So tell me what you actually thought about this course. Those actually do get used to help figure out what we should do next time. So it would help. OK? Any questions about course mechanics stuff? Pretty straightforward. OK, good. So today we're going to do cognition and mental health, continuing the sort of weirding trend of this course. I think it gets weird at the end now. I hope this seems relevant. I think the basic idea is just to use the skills that we have on our own thoughts. Like, really, that's the whole idea of this course or this class, and the next class is that. But like, OK, so last time we talked about cognitive biases, these sort of systematic biases that people seem to have built in general, and how they can distort your perceptions and judgments, so they can lead you to accept bad arguments that you shouldn't have accepted. And the bad news about that was that many of the beliefs that people in general hold are not well justified. That should disturb you at least somewhat, right? Like, you shouldn't be thrilled with that news. But the good news is that at least some of the suffering that you experience in your life is probably due to biased or distorted beliefs rather than kind of immovable objective features of your external world. Certainly not all of the suffering that you experience is like that. There are some just really just objectively bad things that happen to people, and a healthy person responds with sadness or fear or anger when something objectively bad happens. But at least some of your suffering is due to misframing your experience or framing it in irrational ways. And that's good news, because that means you can do at least some intervention on those biased or distorted perceptions and reduce some of the suffering in your life. So that's good, right? And that's kind of the theme of today. That's what we're going to talk about today, is trying to use some of this critical thinking stuff in order to help you better regulate your own mind and therefore emotions and therefore behavior. Yeah? And I think really just like all of the stuff that we've been talking about all semester is directly applicable here. Pretty much directly applicable to just like turn this stuff, instead of analyzing editorials from the Toronto Star, analyze your own internal monologue. Like that's the basic idea. But we'll get into more details than that, of course. So yeah, that's that. OK, but I want to just take one step back before we get into that. I'm going to take at least one step back and talk more generally, because it would be easy to think that what I'm saying here is that you can think yourself into mental health. And that is badly mistaken. You cannot just have this stuff as one part of your strategy for keeping yourself sane. OK? So I would recommend to every single one of you that you have some kind of plan for your own mental health. Every human, I would recommend, should have a plan for this. If you're mentally healthy, if you feel mentally healthy, now is the perfect time to start working on your plan, right? Because you've got the resources, you've got the mental space to do this. If you're distressed and in a bad place, now is also a good time to start working on your plan, because you need help urgently, right? So really anybody should, if you don't already have some kind of plan about how you're going to like not just be mentally healthy now, but be such that you can deal with all of the complexities and difficulties that you're going to have in your life. Like, if you have any kind of interesting life at all, it's going to be filled with suffering and disappointment and all kinds of bad stuff, as well as the good stuff. So you need to be able to robust enough to handle that stuff. If you don't have an interesting life, you also need a kind of plan like this, because that's a kind of suffering in itself. Just having a boring life is also quite demoralizing. So I would recommend that at least these things should be part of your plan. You should be considering all of these things like carefully. The main thing probably is sleep. You need sleep. If you look at the treatment plans for practically any of the common psychiatric disorders, trying to regulate your sleep is on every single one of them. If you have anxiety, figure out your sleep. Depression, figure out your sleep. Psychotic symptoms, figure out your sleep. Obsessive compulsive, sleep. If you don't get sufficient sleep, you cannot do, like, you will be substantially impacted. And I don't know. So probably you can't just like flip a switch and get enough sleep because you're busy people, but like I would strongly recommend that you prioritize this. The grad students I know, the people who did really well in school, generally didn't do all-nighters because you're just flooding your brain with stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline and stuff like that. So it is really not good practice, and if you can get ahead of it, that's great. You also need to consider your diet. Not that you need to be on a diet, but you need to have enough food in you to like be, you need vitamins, you need omega-3s, you need like a reasonable diet. Another piece of your mental health plan. Physical activity. You need to be doing at least some of it, more than none, certainly. Being physically active doesn't make you smarter, but it does make you able to handle more stress, and being able to handle stress makes you smarter, right? You're more able to deal with the various challenges that you're engaged in. Like walking is enough. Walking is sufficient to check this thing, but you got to have something. Okay. Talking to people about your feelings, very seriously, and we'll get back to this as we go into this. Never describing your own emotional state to another human is a recipe for disaster. If you have friends that you trust and who are not like toxic people, that would be fine. A therapist is an expert at this. A therapist is a neutral third person who, like, it doesn't even matter if they have some magical insight. Like, it's not gonna, typically they don't just like ask you about your dreams and your parents and then give you some magical insight that solves your problems. Really the thing that helps is saying this stuff out loud to another person who doesn't have a stake in the thing. It is extremely helpful, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be the case. Medication as necessary, and if you're in a bad place, this might be the one you want to start with, because everything else I just described takes a whole bunch of work. You have to do a bunch of work, which if you're mentally in a bad place, you don't have the resources to invest. So this is why medication is often the first thing that they do, and it can genuinely help you. It doesn't help everybody, it genuinely helps a lot of people. So there's that. So those are kind of like minimum bits of your mental health plan that you should be formulating for yourself, satisfying those in one way or the other. And today we're going to talk about the last one on this list, which is just doing like cognitive self-regulation. And I want to propose to you that, just like getting your diet together is not going to solve all your problems, getting your cognitive self-regulation together is not going to solve all your problems. This is by no means going to be like, oh, now I'm fine and perfect and I can handle anything, but it is an extremely helpful tool. Okay, so I just wanted to put the stuff that we're going to talk about in some kind of perspective. This is not like going to solve all your problems, but this stuff really is super helpful for, regulating your own emotional life. And the point of this was just, you need a plan for regulating your own mental and emotional lives. Every one of us does. Okay. So, that voice in your head? Sometimes called the internal monologue. Whenever you're not really doing anything, it's usually chattering away. If you're like most people have this little voice in the back of their head. Sometimes it's not just your voice, sometimes it's somebody else's voice. You hear a conversation or something like that. So what I want to suggest is that it's possible to apply these critical thinking skills to the content of that internal monologue. And when you can do that, that lets you push back a little on some of the biases that we talked about last time. Right, so if you have biased or distorted thinking, if you can get a bit of critical distance from the content of that voice, it can be super duper helpful, right? And then you can apply all this critical thinking stuff to your own emotionally loaded thoughts. Most people, most of the time, kind of automatically identify with that voice. They think, that's me, right? When you hear a voice in your head, you go, that's me, that's my thought. So you're not hearing that at a distance. You're just basically identified with your internal monologue. In order to criticize your own, in order to do this thing that I'm suggesting that you should try, which is to do critical thinking skills on your own thoughts, you have to have at least some distance from the content of that voice. Yeah, you have to have at least be able to see it as an object of experience rather than as part of yours, like you, right? A quick warning, there are some people who are not identified enough with that, right? So you can have somebody diagnosed with a dissociative disorder experiences that internal monologue as something coming out of nowhere, and that can be in itself a problem. So there's a kind of happy medium here between just being automatically identified with it and believing whatever it says and not having any sense that it's you. I mean, your internal monologue is certainly part of you, right? Like just like your hands and legs and organs are all parts of you. It's the activity of part of you, but it's not the essential you. It's not like whatever that says is what you really, really think. Because sometimes it says bizarre and unhelpful things, right? Sometimes it says, I wonder what would happen if I swerved the wheel and like went into traffic. Yeah? Like, I think most people have that style of thought at least once in a while. And you should say, well, voice, no. Or so this comic here, this is the internal voice saying they don't care about you. And this guy has a healthy amount of distance from that voice to say, yeah, they do. I can tell. Despite the fact that it's ringing in his ears that this is so. Yeah? So that would be a helpful thing for you to have. I would suggest have at least some critical distance from that voice. So I would like to propose that we try an exercise. Now, this is the very first steps of Zen meditation as it was taught to me in a like beginner's course in a Zen temple. If you think this is dumb or you feel uncomfortable or you don't feel like doing this for whatever reason, it is not obligatory. So totally opt out, be on your phone, I don't care, that's fine. If you feel like doing this though, we'll try. I'd like to do about 3 minutes of this. And the point is, so here's basically the practice. You're just gonna sit there comfortably, and the metaphor is you sit like a mountain. So you sit tall and still, and then around you are gonna be clouds. Your thoughts, your feelings, songs in your head, and what you're gonna do is act like a mountain that's surrounded by clouds. You're just gonna sit there. You're not gonna try to stop them, but neither are you gonna be blown away by them, right? So that's what a mountain does in response to clouds. And okay, so you're gonna sit there tall like a mountain while your thoughts swirl around, but you're gonna try to maintain a kind of focused attention on your breath. And the exercise is you count the cycles of your breath. So you breathe in and breathe out. On the exhale, you count 1. Breathe in, breathe out. The exhale, count 2, 3, 4, 5. You get to 5, start again at 1. And that's all. So you just sit there. You're not trying to empty your mind. You're just trying to keep enough of your focus on your breath to keep this count going. And if you find that you've lost count, you just start again at 1. And I want to warn you that practically everybody who tries this loses count pretty much right away. Very, very few people. I think I'd be surprised if anybody sits here and does, I propose to do 3 minutes of this. I'll be surprised if anybody makes it through the 3 minutes without losing count, unless you've done some of this stuff before. Yeah? Okay. You know this? Okay. I'm going to set a timer, and I'll sit and do this with you. So sit like a mountain, tall and still. Around you are going to swirl a bunch of thoughts, and you're just going to, and I want to say, so like typically between counts, I have a bunch of thoughts go through my head. So long as you keep count, you're doing it, okay? So you have a breath and then like, blah, 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 my weekend, whatever. So long as you can get back to it by the time you're exhaling again, you are successfully maintaining focus. Okay? Okay, so 3 minutes, and I will stop us. Is there any questions before we start on this? This is bizarre. I'm nervous about doing this because this is the weirdest thing I've ever done in a classroom, but okay, good. Okay, so 3 minutes, try to follow your breath. Okay? Okay, that was 3 minutes. Okay, so how did that go? All right. I hope nobody got stuck at 1. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody did get stuck at 1. Like, people have radically different sort of capacities for doing this. Did anybody find that just to be a breeze and they had no trouble kind of like, yeah, okay, good. All right, so that's good. You've got some quite good kind of like ability to regulate your own thoughts. So what I hoped that you got out of that, or what I hope that you can sort of reflect on out of that, was 2 things. One, that you don't have total control over your thoughts. And this is a helpful thing to think about simply because it helps you disidentify from these thoughts. Like, if those thoughts were really, really you, shouldn't you be able to control them completely? Right? Like, if this was the center of your voluntary like activities, shouldn't you be able to just like make them do whatever you want? Okay, I want to count my breaths for 3 minutes, I'll do that, no problem. But it's not, right? These thoughts are partly just spontaneous products of your brain or whatever. The other thing I hoped you got out of this was that you don't have 0 control over these. So if you got to 2 at any point, that means that you decided what would be the content of your internal monologue, at least a little bit. And if you practice this for like 5 minutes a day, every day, you get better and better at it, you gain more and more control over your own internal monologue, right? So you have some control over this. Not perfect control, but more than none. Yeah? Okay, so that was the point of that. And so there's a whole range, there's a whole world of meditation practices where you do this kind of thing intensively for long periods, and part of the idea of it, so one of the things that it's supposed to do for you is to give you some space from your own mental experiences so that you're not face deep in them. You get a little bit of distance, and that distance gives you the space that you need to readjust your relationship with it, right? So that you can even begin to do the stuff of like critically analyzing and asking, is this realistic? Is this, is this accurate? Is this biased in some way? Okay? So it's a skill in and of itself, and probably you already have more than none of it. Like, I assume that all of you have at least some metacognitive ability, but know that it's a skill like any other that you can train to whatever degree that you want. You can literally practice this stuff. Consult your local wisdom tradition for more details. Okay, so if you can do this, what can you do with it? And there's a modality of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy that'll sort of feature prominently in the rest of this lecture and the lecture to come, where you use this space that you've hopefully got a little bit of to intervene on this cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So the basic idea is that thoughts create feelings create behavior, and behavior reinforces thought, something like that. They probably all mash together in some ultra complex way, but like, you kind of can't, I don't know how to make myself feel a particular way. Like, I can't just be like, be happy, and boom, I'm happy. Intervening on your behavior is also really hard. Like, if you've ever had an addiction, it's like, well, what if I just stop being addicted? What if I just stop doing that? Well, mixed results there, to be honest. Like, this is, yeah.
Well, it might not work, like, you say, and it happens, push.
Yeah.
But there's enough study that, psychic-wise, like, for example, there were studies conducted where certain people were made to say certain things just before going to sleep.
They would what?
They were made to say certain things.
Aha, okay.
For example, I remember this study where
Yeah, but this is intervening on your thoughts, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's hang on. So you can change your behavior, right? You can change your behavior, but the most effective way I'm going to suggest is by intervening on your thinking. That is the content of your ideas, right? So that's the part. Just the point here is not that you can't do anything about these. You can regulate your emotions. If you breathe deeply for 5 minutes, that will make you calmer than if you hadn't. You can intervene directly on your behavior if you like. I don't know, I saw a video or a story about a guy who was addicted to heroin, so he like had himself chained to a bed to go through detox. Like, that's intervening pretty directly on your behavior, making your thoughts and feelings irrelevant for a small amount of time. But the most effective way, or one of the really effective ways to intervene on this whole cycle, is to change the way you think, right? And this is what cognitive behavioral therapy is supposed to be able to help you do. So you learn how to think differently, and you can intervene at that point. I'm sure you can change your feelings and behavior to some degree, for sure. But this is an easy one, right? This is a fairly straightforward place to intervene, and the effects can be worth your while anyway. Okay. So the simplest possible version of this is just to analyze the arguments that go through your head. So like, here's an argument that goes through lots of people's heads. I failed the test, therefore I am terrible. I'm a terrible person. And if you've got the emotional space to do so, if you've got enough emotional distance from that thought to critically analyze it, it's pretty straightforward, right? Like, how would you rate this as an argument? Poor, right? This is a poor argument. The premise, while relevant, is by far not sufficient to establish the conclusion, right? Wouldn't you want to know more in order to say whether you accept the conclusion of this argument? You should. Lots of good people fail tests, right? So although it might be, so you would say, yeah, I accept the conclusion. The premise is acceptable. The fact of the matter is that you failed the test. And it's somewhat relevant, but clearly it has not got sufficient relevance to establish the conclusion and be an adequate argument. I think that's what you should say. Well, that's what a perfectly healthy, normal, reasonable person would say to themselves if they had the critical distance. Usually this is, so if you can do it, this is great. Real simple, straightforward, just the direct application of critical thinking to your own internal monologue. However, lots of things, like if you're having this thought, chances are you're not feeling healthy and robust and ready to critically analyze things. The chances are that if you're having this thought, you're feeling far less than perfect, and that can significantly impair your ability to get that distance. So, if you're sleepy, if you're hungry, if you're chronically depressed or anxious, if you're in physical pain, and so on and so on and so on, all of those things make it harder to get the distance from that thought so that you can apply these things, so that you can ask yourself rationally, like, does that inference actually make sense? And even if you can do that, even if you can critically analyze the thought, it doesn't necessarily mean that it stops being compelling for you, right? Like, you can know that an inference that you're making is bad, but it still has this really powerful emotional grip on you. So this is, even if you can do this, it is not the simple solution that you might want, but it can be a way of pushing back at least a little, right? And there's a couple other techniques that I'd like to talk about that can enhance this at least a little bit. So getting critical space, techniques for getting critical space. So psych studies have shown that what they call a self-immersed perspective, that is when you're fully in your own point of view, makes it harder for people to critically analyze their own thoughts. And what they think is that you should try at least sometimes to get what they call a self-distance. So contrast self-immersed, where you're just like, I'm me, I'm doing this, to self-distance, where you can kind of see yourself from the outside a little bit. And there's a couple of simple things I want to talk about that kind of make it easier to do this. One thing that you can do is to consider yourself in the third person. Literally imagine yourself as one of your friends. Try to literally be a friend to yourself. If you had a friend in the same situation as you, what would you tell them? Yeah? This is especially important when you're feeling bad about yourself, because if it's you that screwed up, you can get really, really over the top on criticizing yourself. So what would you say to a friend in the same situation as you? Just for example, I don't know what my job's going to be a year from now. I have work for the next semester, just finished my PhD. I have no idea what I'm going to do in my career from here on. Like I have no work lined up. And the future is quite uncertain. So that causes me considerable anxiety and stress, right? I'm worried about that. Now, when I think about my friend Michael, who's in the exact same position as me, he's just finished his PhD program, my thoughts about that are radically different. I think, well, Michael's a capable guy. He's got a PhD. He's charming, he's articulate, he can do stuff. He'll be fine. Michael will be fine. I'm worried. But we're in the exact same situation. Yeah? So to the extent that you can think about yourself as somebody other than you would think about you, you can get a little bit of this critical distance. You can do this with your own memories as well. So there's been a bunch of studies on sort of thinking through memories which are traumatic or difficult. And they found that if they cued people to think through them from the first person perspective, people were much more disturbed than if you asked them to think through them like literally like a top-down view. So you imagine the scene with you in it and whatever else is happening from like a camera off to the side rather than through your own eyeballs. People reported being significantly less disturbed by rethinking through the thing. Yeah? Because it's again, you're shifting your perspective out of your first personal perspective. And the fact is that we react very differently to things from our first person perspective than we do from third person perspective. Right? From the view from outside of yourself and the view from inside of yourself are not symmetrical. We do not react the same to them. And thinking about the cognitive biases stuff, you might think of some reasons why that might be the case. You can also use third-person pronouns. So this is a really easy one. Instead of saying like, I'm stressed and anxious, what should I do, to yourself, you can say, okay, Corey. Okay, Corey's stressed. What should Corey do? Yeah? Simply referring to yourself in the third person helps to create this critical distance. I wouldn't go around doing this for your friends. Corey's going to get lunch. But when you're thinking about your own stuff, this can help you get that critical distance, right? That space that you need to even begin to question your own automatic responses and stuff like that. Yeah? So there's a bunch of stuff like that. Another really helpful technique is, like, practically every psychiatric modality suggests that you do this. Just write a journal. Write the stuff down. It feels, I'm not a feelings kind of guy, generally speaking, so this feels really awkward to me. But nonetheless, push through that. Be tough, feel things, write them down, and when it's on the page, it often looks quite different. Like, you respond to the words on the page differently than when they're just echoing in your head. Yeah? Sometimes you look at it and go, well, that's bonkers. Nobody should believe that thing that I just wrote down. Or you might become more convinced, right? You might say, so-and-so is being mean to me, and that makes me feel bad. And in your head, you sound like a whiny little wimp, but when you look at it on the page, you go, oh, no, that's actually a legitimate thing. I actually have a perfectly good reason to be upset here. Right? So it can look differently when you write it down. And again, this is just getting a little bit of distance from that internal process. Right? You process it, instead of processing it through the I am filters, you're processing it through your normal linguistic stuff coming from outside filters, and that can make a difference. Talking to a therapist is pretty much, I would suggest, the same thing, or it can help do the same thing. It's not the only thing that therapists are good for by any means. There's lots of things that they can help you with that aren't just this. But here's a basic fundamental reason why you might talk to a therapist. It's because you say it, and the moment you say it to somebody else, you can hear it through their ears in some sense. So you're modeling them and imagining how they're hearing it. Right? So you do this loop where, to you it sounds horrible. You say it out loud, and this person hears it, and you go, well, how horrible do I think it sounded to them? And maybe it's not as horrible, or maybe it's more horrible. Anyway, same basic idea. The journal is cheaper, much cheaper, and more private, but the therapist is really, really good at this stuff. They are experts at doing this in a way that, maybe your friends aren't, to be honest. Your friends might not be the emotional sounding board that you need because they're very invested in you, and saying things about yourself can make you anxious. If you say that you're feeling terrible, it feels like you're dropping on the social hierarchy or something like that. The therapist is specifically trained not to make you feel like that. So distancing, at least. You need this. Okay. So suppose you've generated some critical distance. Suppose you're able to do metacognition, you're able to at least be aware of the content of your thoughts. Furthermore, you've figured out one way or the other how to get a little bit of distance from your thoughts. Okay, now what do you do with that space? I think we'll talk about this next time as well, all the things that you can do with this space. I want to start off with just some stuff about reframing. So, thanks, Intel. Right. So, recall that we've all got these framing biases. This is the stuff like people react much more favorably to 90% success than 10% failure. They react much more strongly to a 5% penalty than a 5% bonus. Yeah. So the exact same information presented different ways can affect you differently. And it's bad news in the sense that we're less than perfectly rational, but it's good news in the sense that if you know this about yourself, and you're having maladaptive thoughts, you're having unhelpful thoughts, and you have the space to intervene on them, you can reframe your own cognition. You can do a little bit of this reframing and change the way that you respond to the objective facts in your environment, right? So there's some objective facts in your environment, you can't change those, but you can change the way you process them. And this can legitimately help. So my favorite example, and this is one I do all the time, I don't like being on a packed subway car. I don't like touching strangers. Really, I don't feel comfortable at all in that environment. So this produces anxiety, and I usually get mad at everybody around me, like, take off your backpack, you bastard. So if I frame that situation in terms of how much nicer it would be if I was on a relatively empty streetcar, or subway or streetcar, I get mad, like I'm mad. If my frame is, I can be in this, like sardine can, or I could be in a spacious streetcar, I'm like, oh, this is a terrible situation, and I feel bad for myself and mad at everybody else. And so having noticed this, what I typically do when I see myself getting worked up in this way is imagine that I've just been rescued from a desert island or released from solitary confinement or some other like extreme isolation. So if the contrast is between being on a full subway or being on a nicely open one, that's bad. But if the contrast is being amongst humans or being completely isolated, you'd be grateful. If you just got back from a desert island, I bet you'd be grateful to see all these people. Like, oh, look at all these humans. If I was, like in desperate need, maybe one of them would help me. I could talk to them. I could interact with them. Look at, humans, great. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that this makes me feel awesome about being packed in with sweaty strangers who don't know how to respect people's space. But it keeps me from being angry. So instead of being pissed off that I'm in this situation, I can at least be calm about it. I literally do this all the time. Like when I'm in this situation, this is my go-to image. And it's about, so the technique is about changing your contrast class, changing the class of comparisons that you make from one that's unhelpful to one that's more helpful. Yeah? And I mean, it would be bad if you're just fooling yourself. If the way you get through your day is just by fooling yourself, that's bad. You don't want to do that. But I don't think this is an instance of that. Neither one of those comparison classes is objectively correct in any way, right? Comparison classes aren't right or wrong. They're helpful or unhelpful. Yeah? Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, fooling yourself? I guess to fool myself in this situation, I guess you could tell yourselves things that are just not true. Like, I love being around sweaty strangers. This is great for me. I'm super comfortable in this situation. Those things are just not true, right? Those are false facts. Telling yourself that, I don't know, I'm not into the idea of lying to yourself to be happy. But if you just shift, you can shift your framework for comparison, though, without fooling yourself. Because again, I don't see any reason why one of those contrast classes is the right one. I see one that is imposed on me by my daily routine and that you would automatically fall into. And I see one that makes me mad. And I see another one that's perfectly legitimate. Like, people do get isolated. It's not like that's not a real thing. And you can generate a little bit of gratitude for your situation by comparing yourself to some other group. Yeah? Here's another one. Here's a fun one. So I would suggest that these people could use a little bit of reframing, that it would do them a bit of good. So the question is, do you consider yourself wealthy? This was put out by a magazine. A bunch of people were asked. And people with from $1 to $5 million in investable assets, not just like their total net worth, money that they could throw around at whatever they felt like. You ask those people, do you feel wealthy? And about 28% of them will tell you no. I do not feel wealthy. And 40% of people who have more than $5 million in investable assets will tell you no, I don't feel wealthy. So how did this happen? Why would this happen? I would suggest that it's something like, so if you go to a private school and there are 3 kids there whose parents have $100 million in investable assets, and 3 kids there who have tens of millions of dollars in investable assets, and your poor parents only have $1 million in investable assets, you might feel poor, right? So your social situation can strongly impose a contrast class on you. The people that you interact with, the kind of social world that you exist in, can strongly compel a certain framework on you. Now, are you stuck with that? Can you push back against that? I would suggest that yes, you absolutely can push back against that. So if you're in one of these people that have more than 5 million in investable assets and you don't feel wealthy, maybe expand your contrast class a little to include the rest of us, right? I don't think that, and again, ask yourself, is one of those, so if your only contrast is people I hang out with who are ultra rich, or your contrast class is people in North America, or maybe people in the whole world, is there some reason why one of those is the correct comparison? Like, I don't think these are even up for being correct or incorrect. I think they are either helpful or unhelpful. And maybe there are situations in which just comparing yourself to your social peers is a helpful comparison class. I don't want to say you should never do that, right? I do think, though, that if you find yourself in possession of multi-million dollars and you don't feel wealthy, it may help you to expand your contrast class a little bit, right? It might help you feel grateful for what you've got, which is that's a good thing, right? Like, you want to feel gratitude for anything that's good in your life to connect with the things that are going well for you. And if you're only comparing yourself to people who are richer than you, you're not going to get to do that. So, it's important to note here that you can't just think, okay, here's my new frame, and then you fully inhabit that new frame, no traces of the old frame, you just reframe the situation and done. So again, with the wealth example, it's very likely that your social situation is strongly imposing a framework on you. Like, your brain is set up to notice differences, mostly, not absolutes. So if the difference between you and the person beside you is they have 10 million and you have 2 million, you're pretty much wired to notice that, to pay attention to that. And sometimes frames can be imposed by other things like early life experiences or mental illnesses. So your frame can be pushed on you, a maladaptive framework can be pushed on you by a variety of things, and it ain't easy to get out from under one, right? This is by far not a trivial process. However, if you're aware that the way that you frame your world affects your experience, and you're able to generate enough critical distance from your own internal monologue to intervene on it, and you actually try this stuff, I want to suggest that you can help yourself. You can help yourself be less horrified by the world, be more grateful for when good things happen. You can help yourself suffer less by doing this kind of stuff. That's my proposal to you. And I strongly recommend you don't get attached to your own suffering. Like, if your goal in life is to just have a good time, suffering is completely antithetical to that goal. If your goal in life is to help other people as much as possible, you need to be as sound and healthy as possible to be effective in the world to help other people. Right? So whether you're self-oriented or other-oriented, either way, you need to be solid in yourself to get what you want. So don't be proud of your maladaptive framework. Like, I'm only going to compare myself to the top of the top because that's where I need to be. That's not going to help anybody. It's certainly not going to help you, right? Okay. Okay, that's it for today. We'll talk more about this stuff on Thursday. Thanks, everyone.